3 rules for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords playing Carcassonne, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne, in a land of fantasy where reality lies. 1 rule to ring them all, 1 rule to find them, 1 rule called Fireball, over all logic binds them, in the land of fantasy where reality dies. I'm Rich Mayo, and this is Modern Games. Because Fireball, this 1 rule has been used for a generation to negate any conversation about consistency in role-playing games. If you ask why a 10th level fighter can hurl himself from a 200-foot cliff onto rocks and survive, half of the internet will rise up against you in an unholy chorus. But wizards cast Fireball. If you question why your character is paralyzed for 90% of the game time and unable to react to the simplest things around them, they will shout, "It is fantasy. What about Fireball?" If you ask how a farmer gets his donkey up Stone Bridge in the Forgotten Realms, you're going to get the answer magic. Whatever the follow-up questions you ask, whatever clarifications and stipulations you invoke, however much you try to steer the conversation back to a poor farmer and a stubborn donkey staring up at an ungodly continental staple 400 feet above them, and howsoever you wax poetically about the what-if premise, explain the purpose of a bridge, ruminate about the rules of magic, or espouse how a world must absorb its own premise, eventually, like an argument on the internet ending with the Nazis, every argument about role-playing games ultimately meets its final impasse and ends in because Fireball. I have long rejected this argument as a facile conflation of cause and effect, a dismissal of logic, an abdication of any responsibility towards a shared and cohesive world, and an utterly abominable laziness of thought. In short, I wasn't a fan. But I was wrong. Very wrong. My argument has a fatal flaw. It presupposes one thing and rests so firmly on this foundational principle that in its absence I cannot and must not disagree with because of Fireball as an axiomatically perfect syllogism that negates mine and any other objection to the finality with which it closes any discussions about Dungeons & Dragons. You see, without a premise for magic in a setting, my viewpoint is garbage. And because Fireball trumps every objection. My argument has always been that a setting should be internally consistent after you accept the premise that creates it. I've called this verisimilitude or plausibility or simply respecting and playing by your own rules. Yet it all hinges on this simple belief that magic has a source. If our GM has crafted a setting, carefully weighing the implications of magic, where it comes from, how it forms, how it works, how it fails, how it infuses and alters the world around it, then we can point to an object or event and say, not magical, or magical, or magic cannot change this. Now, I'm not saying we have to go full-blown Brandon Sanderson here and have an entirely strict codified set of rules that will be uncovered through a series of books or adventures. But I will cede to his point that if a character is going to use the nature of magic to resolve plot points in a book, or an episode, or an adventure, then the solution must come from the already established rules. Otherwise, it becomes a convenient get-out-of-thinking card. The characters resolve their stories with the tools that they have. When magic is one of those tools and used to resolve the action, it must observe its own rules or else be a highly objectionable deus ex machina, the god of the ancient early Greek theater, the god of the machine, where the conflict and rising tension of the play was resolved by the gods coming down and literally setting things right. It was a lazy and unsatisfying conclusion even to the early Greeks 3,000 years ago. So what is the premise of magic in D&D? And here's where my cheese started to slide off my cracker. D&D doesn't have one. It has many. Just like the creature cantina of races that fill our source books, magic comes in so many forms and none of them are clear. You can't write a system of magic that appeals to everyone. And that's what they've tried to do. So they're doing a different kind of magic. They're misdirecting, giving a meaningless, empty void of everything. Magic is focused by objects. Oh, it's part of your hereditary. Or it springs from your mind, or for a while it was Vancian and relied upon mnemonic study. It can be released by precise repetition of words and gestures that have magical power, or comes from the gods. Well, which gods? Greek gods? Egyptian gods? Pseudo-Greek? Or special? Yes, all of them. Powerful forces from other realms too, angels and demons. Well, rich realms, all of them. We have the abyss and Avernus and the heavens. We have all the heavens, all the best heavens. Take a look at the chart at the back of the original deities and demigods. You get a sense of there's just so many layers on this wheel that everything's in there. We have all kinds of monsters too. You know, which monsters? Well, all of the monsters, the best monsters. So if we don't have a premise, why was I ever worried about the conclusion? Why does a potion take effect the moment it is ingested? Why isn't there an onset period? Oh, I forgot. Magic. Why does magic consume material components when it does? Oh yes, magic. Well, the answer to every question about magic is magic. Then it could be pretty clear, very quickly, that all conversations on this topic are going to become circular. The GM can try to make a world that's plausible if they want. They could try to make a world like we find in fantasy novels, Guy Gavriel Kay, Dave Duncan, Scott Lynch, Tolkien, Brandon Sanderson, Brent Weeks, George Martin, Robin Hobb, Ursula Le Guin, and on and on and on. And thank you. Please keep them all coming. Doing this, making worlds, is not just an act of creation, but it's a one of negation, deletion, selection, editing, brutal editing. When you write a story about everything, you write a story about nothing. These authors have a premise about nature of magic in their world, the nature of their world, and they stay true to that premise. They explore it. They soak in it. That's how they make their worlds come alive. We as old school dungeon masters used to make up our own rules about magic when we made our settings. There were two sources of power in the rules that needed to be accounted for: the divine power of the cleric and the arcane power of the magic user. Each setting I played in, at each table I sat down at, would have their own spin on what these powers were and where they came from. I knew why in my worlds, why a god couldn't give a character more spells just to make their pantheon stronger. I knew why a god shouldn't or couldn't take spells away or directly interfere with the characters, in spite of the Greek tradition of doing, well, exactly that. Well, actually mostly that. You know, the idea behind the majority of their mythology. So we had rules for onset times for different potions. And we differentiated between brews and bibes and poultices and concoctions and all other types of potions, lotions and potions. I understood the interaction between the two arcane primal forces, fate and chaos, that were built into my worlds. And I had all the basics laid down before I even started running games in high school. Everyone had their own version of this. Each table had their own setting and logic. What I didn't account for and didn't realize till a few days ago, after playing D&D for more than 40 years, what I was still not crystal clear to me is that the rules don't ask you to do this. And as the rules have grown, it's been harder and harder to actually do this. People can just pick up the game and read the rules, and they're given this default generic PAP setting that does not ask them to provide this understanding. And without this premise, as the editions grew, they just kept piling material upon material, to the point where I don't even think you can do this anymore. D&D designers gave us all the content that we could ever want, all the options, so that players could play anything they want. But by ceding control of the setting to the players, the GM loses the ability to adjudicate the nature of magic, to determine what is and is not reasonable and rational, because those things get defined by the rules. The game, the rules, swallow the setting and the story. Until your GM takes ownership of the setting, there is no logic. This means that the game companies shouldn't be selling dozens of books to the players who outnumber the GM 4 or 5 to 1, but they should sell disproportionately to the GMs, the smaller part of their market. I know why they don't. You know why they don't. D&D is too broadly inert, too incongruous, too spiced with everything, every culture, every monster, every magic, and every ability, that it becomes vanilla. This isn't a function of setting. You can't fix it. You can wholesale ban a whole series of classes as problematic for whatever reason. You can limit caster levels. You can make armor provide damage reduction instead of armor class. But eventually you'll be confronted by the fact that you cannot balance your rule changes as well as they have been done by the D&D designers themselves. These rules are expertly balanced. Sure, the naked barbarian is the one who can soak up tons of damage but doesn't hit very hard, and the armored knight hits hard but is fragile. So what if they play backwards? They play balanced. I like to think that one of the designers did this in a Shakespearean as you like it, what you will, thumb in your eye to those button-bashing simpletons who would never even notice. The rogue has to do lots of damage on their sneak attack so that they're balanced. The rule because fireball can just as easily be called because sneak attack, or because sentinel, or because turns. Because when you give to one player something that doesn't make sense, it is unfair to force another player to have to make sense. I would make arguments about consistency and logic, and I wasn't standing on solid ground. The convincing argument is, the wizard doesn't have to make sense, so why does my rogue? The wizard and the sorcerer were given fireball, not because it was a consistent part of the fantasy setting and an inevitable result of the nature of this shared imaginary world, but as an unexplained cheat. Everybody gets to cheat. D&D is a game of cheat. If you ever played that card game, if you haven't, look it up. The game of cheat. So why can't the fighter cheat? Why can't a 3-foot halfling armed with a dagger and the sentinel feet stop a gargantuan dragon from flying past? The rules are built around cheating. Here's a quote from the player's handbook. That said, many racial traits and other game elements break the general rules in some way, creating an exception on how the rest of the game works. Remember this. If a specific rule contradicts a general rule, the specific rule wins. Gravity, bending moments, inertia, causality, logic. These are just general rules, and the specific rules of D&D have primacy over them. Now, I know that we can also find a passage that makes the DM the final arbiter of all things. And I know that these comments are going to get flooded, well, with a whole series of, well, you can just fix X with Y, or the game works perfectly. You have to have a great GM. To me, this argument misses the point, and I'm not complaining. Suppose I said that the John Deere E100 riding lawnmower was not a good vehicle for the highway. I love my John Deere E100 and it mows my lawn very well. Well, then I get roasted in the comments about all the highly modified souped up lawnmowers with inline 10 engines and racing suspension. Well, that's not really the John Deere E100, and I'm pretty sure you haven't built the thing you're talking about, and I'm pretty sure this fixed version of D&D is just imaginary as the John Deere racing tractor. D&D is a beer and pretzels role-playing game. If you're using it for deep dramatic role-playing, there are better choices. I'm not criticizing your ability to do wonderful things with the game. I've had great sessions of D&D and I love the game. Here's my point. D&D does not explain where magic comes from. When you look at the rules, you cannot come up with a unifying nature of magic. You can't even get to an amorphous hint as to what its nature is. To make sense of D&D from a plausibility point of view, you have to drastically edit the content. Overruling the rules in the name of common sense is unfair to the players, because there isn't one singly logically consistent class in the game. D&D is an exception-based system. The rule system is fragile, detailed, and has many components that rest on one another. And it is expertly and finely balanced. It's a house of cards. Now, you give this house of cards to a player and ask them to make up characters and play in this imaginary world, they will go through the rule book and build a character they want to play based on those rules. You shouldn't change those rules during play because something else makes more sense, or some idiot like me wanted to talk about verisimilitude. You go on playing D&D. Go easy on the house rules. Changing an in to an and an to an on, you could ruin somebody's character in a heartbeat. If a player asks why a goblin can run across the room and through a door before their character with the hand on the handle can close it, shrug your shoulders and say, because fireball. 3 rules for the elven kings under the sky. 7 for the dwarf lords playing Carcassonne. 9 for mortal men doomed to die. 1 for the Dark Lord Pokemon in the land of dungeons where dragons die. 1 rule to ring them all. 1 rule to find them. The 1 rule called Fireball over all logic binds them in the land of dungeons where logic dies. I hope you've enjoyed my rumination on because Fireball, and I hope it gives you some perspective into looking for what kind of game you're going to run. If you've enjoyed this content, you want to see similar things, please like and subscribe, and I look forward to hearing your comments and your feedback as we grow this. I'd also love to hear where you sit on this because Fireball rule, and especially because I'm a recent convert to because Fireball really is appropriate answer for D&D. I'd just like to see if other people are going to agree with me. Thanks very much. I'll see you next time.